340 kilometers of cargo, frozen on a single track, because 8 men with the right tools walked into the wrong tunnel. This is the story of the Severomuysk operation, a GUR deep sabotage mission that didn't just blow up a tunnel. It severed one of the most critical arteries feeding Russia's war machine from the east. When the ceiling came down on a loaded ammunition train, the reverberations didn't stop at the blast radius. They traveled 6,000 kilometers west, all the way to the front lines of Donetsk. I'm your host at East Alert, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we go deep, past the front lines, past Ukraine's borders, deep into Siberia, where a mountain holds a secret Russia never expected anyone to reach. Because the Severomuysk Tunnel was supposed to be untouchable. Too remote, too deep inside Russian territory, too well monitored, too strategically obvious, a target to be left undefended. But GUR operators have a saying: the things Russia considers untouchable are exactly the things worth touching. Start with the geography. You can't understand the value of this target without understanding the map. Russia has 2 rail corridors connecting its western regions to its Far East industrial base. The first is the Trans-Siberian Railway. Everyone knows it. It runs across the southern tier of Siberia through major population centers, and it has been under strain since the beginning of full-scale operations. Grain, coal, oil, and since the escalation of war production, military hardware. All of it competing for the same tracks, the same locomotives, the same rail schedules. The second corridor is the Baikal-Amur Mainline, the BAM. Built in Soviet times as an alternative route, longer and more northerly than the Trans-Siberian, running through remote territory considered strategically valuable precisely because it was hard to reach. In Soviet doctrine, the BAM was the rail line that would survive a nuclear war when the more obvious Trans-Siberian was destroyed. The backup, the insurance policy, the route no enemy could reach. Russia is currently using both lines at capacity. The Trans-Siberian handles the bulk of civilian and commercial cargo. The BAM handles a growing share of military logistics, munitions manufactured in Russia's Eastern Defense Industrial Base, shells produced in Irkutsk, propellant from Bisk, components assembled in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, all of it moving west on the BAM toward the front. And the BAM has a bottleneck. One single bottleneck that every westbound train must pass through. The Severomuysk Tunnel. 15.3 kilometers long, the longest rail tunnel in Russia. Built through the Severomuysk Ridge, a granite mountain range that offered no alternative route. Every train moving military cargo from Russia's eastern production facilities toward the European part of the country passes through this tube in the rock. Every single one. Ukrainian military intelligence identified the Severomuysk Tunnel as a Tier 1 strategic target. Not because destroying it would feel dramatic, because the math was unambiguous. Trans-Siberian already operating at or above rated capacity. No overflow route available. Destroy the Severomuysk Tunnel and you don't just delay one convoy. You stop everything. You back up cargo 500 kilometers in either direction. You force Russia to divert military shipments to the Trans-Siberian, which then becomes overloaded, which slows civilian supply chains, which creates political pressure, which cascades into reduced frontline resupply of precisely the categories of munitions that Russian ground forces have been consuming at enormous rates. The GUR wargaming team calculated a minimum disruption window of 6 weeks for a controlled demolition targeting the tunnel's primary support structure. A catastrophic collapse, one that buried a loaded train inside, could extend that window to 4 months. 4 months of degraded munition supply to Russian forces on the Donetsk axis. That number was presented to the operational planning cell. The planning cell took 3 weeks to design the mission. Then the selection process began. Which weapon was more decisive in this operation? Precision demolition charges or the intelligence work that made placement possible? Think about that. Comment your answer below. We'll come back to it. Because both pieces of this puzzle were extraordinary. Selecting the team for the Severomuysk operation took longer than planning it. The requirements were unusual, even by GUR's demanding standards. Operators needed to be physically capable of sustained exertion in sub-zero temperatures at altitude. They needed demolitions expertise, specific to hard rock tunnel structures. Understanding stress lines in granite, knowing where to place charges to trigger progressive rather than instantaneous collapse, ensuring the damage couldn't be repaired within weeks by filling the rubble and reopening the bore. They needed to be operationally invisible in Russian civilian environments. Speaking Russian without detectable Ukrainian inflection, capable of holding a cover identity under routine law enforcement contact. And they needed to be willing to operate at a distance from any possible extraction that made this, in plain terms, a one-way mission with an uncertain return path. 8 operators were selected. The team leader was a GUR captain who had previously conducted operations in Russian-controlled territory in the Zaporizhia region. His deputy was a demolition specialist who had spent 2 years studying tunnel infrastructure vulnerabilities as part of Ukraine's strategic interdiction planning program. The remaining 6 were a mix of special reconnaissance and direct action veterans, all with prior experience operating inside Russia or in deep cover environments. The cover architecture was extensive. Ukrainian intelligence had been building commercial and civilian legends, false identities with verifiable histories, in the Russian civilian sphere for operational use. 2 operators would enter Russian territory as road transport contractors affiliated with a Siberian logistics company. The remaining 6 would travel separately, by different routes, in 3 pairs, each with distinct cover stories and documentation sets. They would converge at a staging point in the town of Severomuysk, a small settlement with a rail workers community located 12 kilometers from the tunnel's western entrance. The staging operation took 37 days. The operators moved into position incrementally, establishing themselves in the community, building the local familiarity that makes people invisible. They rented accommodation. They visited local establishments. They observed patterns. They identified the security protocols at the tunnel entrance, the frequency of patrols along the southern maintenance access road, the schedule of technical inspection trains that entered the tunnel structure. One key obstacle emerged early. The tunnel's internal monitoring system had been upgraded. Russian rail security, increasingly aware of infrastructure vulnerability following Ukrainian strikes on western Russian rail nodes, had installed additional vibration sensors inside the Severomuysk bore. Sensors designed to detect unauthorized human movement within the structure between scheduled maintenance windows. The original plan had assumed older monitoring infrastructure. It was now obsolete. Stay with me. Because what happens next forced the operators to redesign their entire approach with 48 hours remaining before the scheduled execution window. The demolition specialists spent 2 days on the problem. The vibration sensors were fixed-point devices, installed at intervals along the tunnel wall, calibrated to detect anomalous movement patterns. Their blind spots were knowable. Maintenance crews moved through the tunnel on a regular schedule, and the sensors were set to ignore the vibration signature of standard maintenance equipment. The solution required acquiring the signature of authorized maintenance vehicles. 2 operators, using their road transport cover, made contact with a maintenance crew supervisor at a local establishment in Severomuysk. Over several evenings, they gathered enough technical detail about maintenance equipment specifications and scheduled passage times to reconstruct the sensor logic. The operators would not move through the tunnel on foot. They would move inside a modified maintenance vehicle, a high rail truck that could run on both road wheels and railway tracks, whose vibration profile they had engineered to match the authorized signature. The vehicle had been sourced by the logistics cover team and modified in a workshop outside the area. 48 hours before execution. The plan was reset. The team was ready. Which weapon was deadlier here? A. The demolition charges. B. The sensor-defeating vehicle modification. C. The intelligence work that built the cover. Comment below. East Alert readers always have the sharpest tactical analysis. The execution timeline began at 11:40 p.m. on a night when the temperature outside the tunnel entrance registered -23 degrees Celsius. 3 operators remained at the staging point, monitoring local communications frequencies and maintaining the team's communications relay. 5 operators loaded into the modified high rail truck, positioned 2 kilometers from the western tunnel entrance using the maintenance access road. The approach took 14 minutes. The truck moved at the speed profile of an authorized maintenance pass. The vibration sensors registered a valid signature. No alarm was triggered. The truck entered the Severomuysk Tunnel at 11:54 p.m. and proceeded east at reduced speed. The tunnel interior. 15.3 kilometers of concrete-lined bore through solid granite. Artificially lit by service lighting at 400-meter intervals. Temperature inside the bore significantly warmer than outside. The mountain absorbs and releases heat, maintaining interior temperatures around 8 degrees Celsius year-round. The service lighting created pools of visibility separated by relative darkness. The air moved with the faint pressure differential created by the tunnel's ventilation system. The sound was a constant background hum of distant blowers and the creak of track structure responding to thermal variation. The demolition specialist had pre-identified 4 charge placement points based on structural analysis of publicly available Soviet-era construction documentation, supplemented by more recent OSINT imagery of the tunnel's ventilation shaft positions and the known locations of its internal expansion joints. The expansion joints were the key. These are the points in a long tunnel where the structure is designed to flex rather than transmit stress rigidly. They are also the points where targeted disruption has the most dramatic effect on structural integrity across a wide area rather than locally. 3 expansion joints. 1 primary support arch section at the 4-kilometer mark from the western entrance, where the tunnel passed through a geological transition zone that the original Soviet engineers had documented as structurally sensitive. The truck stopped at the first placement point at 12:11 a.m. 3 operators secured the vehicle and established a perimeter watch. 2 operators, including the demolition specialist, exited with equipment and moved to the tunnel wall. The charges were bespoke, not commercial mining explosives. Custom fabricated shaped charges designed for hard rock tunnel wall placement, configured to direct the blast into the expansion joint structure rather than outward into the tunnel bore. Each charge assembly weighed approximately 42 kilograms. Each required specific placement orientation to achieve the intended fracture pattern in the surrounding granite. Placing and orienting each charge correctly took between 11 and 18 minutes depending on wall surface conditions. 4 placements. 4 charges. The estimated total placement time was 58 minutes. Actual time, 1 hour and 4 minutes. The geological transition zone at the 4th placement point had surface irregularities not visible in any of the documentary sources. The demolition specialist improvised a stabilization mount from equipment carried in the vehicle. 6 minutes over schedule. The detonation system was designed for maximum delay reliability rather than speed. A primary electronic timer set for 90 minutes from final placement. A secondary mechanical backup timer set for 95 minutes. A tertiary failsafe using a chemical time delay detonator set for 100 minutes. All 3 systems independent. If any one of them functioned, all 4 charges fired simultaneously. The charges were linked in a parallel circuit designed so that each charge had its own detonator, but all detonators were cross-connected to each triggering system. The truck exited the western tunnel entrance at 1:38 a.m. Total time inside the tunnel, 1 hour and 44 minutes. Extraction began immediately. Subscribe to East Alert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens next, in the tunnel and in the days that follow, is a masterclass in strategic effect from a tactical operation. The tunnel was silent at 3:27 a.m. A westbound freight train, mixed cargo, military designation, had entered the eastern portal at 2:51 a.m. Standard transit time for a freight consists through the Severomuysk Tunnel at reduced speed, approximately 45 minutes. At 3:27 a.m., that train was inside the tunnel, approximately 6 kilometers from the western exit. Moving through the geological transition zone, the primary electronic timer reached 0 at 3:23 a.m. 4 charges detonated within 4 milliseconds of each other. The sound inside the tunnel bore would have registered as multiple overlapping concussions, each shaped charge directing its energy into the adjacent granite rather than the open air. But granite under this kind of stress doesn't absorb and hold. It fractures along planes of least resistance, and the expansion joints are precisely those planes. The initial blast-induced fractures propagated through the surrounding rock mass. The ceiling structure at the 4-kilometer mark lost primary support across a 22-meter span. The collapse began. Not instantaneously. The structure failed progressively over approximately 11 seconds. Sections of the concrete tunnel lining dropped first, followed by slabs of granite that had been held in compression by the now disrupted support geometry. The rubble cascade created a secondary shockwave that traveled both directions along the tunnel bore, triggering partial ceiling failures at 2 of the other 3 charge placement points, where the expansion joints had already been weakened. The freight train. 6 kilometers from the western exit at 3:23 a.m., moving at approximately 25 kilometers per hour. The crew would have had no warning. The sound of the detonation traveling west through the tunnel bore at the speed of sound, approximately 340 meters per second in the confined tunnel environment, would have reached the train approximately 17 seconds after the detonation. The shockwave, moving at the same speed, would have reached them within seconds. The train stopped, in the darkness, 6 kilometers from the exit. with the tunnel ceiling collapsing somewhere ahead and the shockwaves still reverberating. OSINT analysis of Russian rail traffic monitoring data, cross-referenced with satellite imagery of the eastern and western Severomuysk terminal areas, showed the following in the hours after the event. Train movement on the BAM through the Severomuysk section ceased completely. At the eastern terminal area, locomotive headlights visible in commercial satellite imagery formed a queue that extended beyond the frame of the imaging swath. Approximately 3 kilometers of waiting consists by dawn. At the western terminal, outbound trains backed into holding sidings. No traffic moved in either direction. How many vehicles and consists would ultimately be backed up on the BAM in either direction? A, 23, B, 38, C, more than 50? We'll give you the answer at the end. Think about it as we continue. The first emergency teams reached the western portal of the Severomuysk Tunnel at approximately 5:10 a.m. They found rubble at the tunnel entrance from secondary debris pressure, material blown toward the exit by the pressure wave, and no ability to enter the structure. The western approach track was partially blocked by displaced ballast and concrete fragments. Russian emergency response had significant assets in the region. The Severomuysk Ridge section of the BAM had its own dedicated engineering maintenance facility at Severomuysk, staffed for exactly these kinds of incidents. But the scale of what they found inside the tunnel was beyond anything the maintenance facility was designed to handle. The collapse zone extended. Preliminary assessment suggested over 60 meters of tunnel length at the primary site, with secondary partial collapses at 2 additional points totaling another 30 meters. A freight train was inside. Its crew transmitted a distress signal before communications degraded. The antenna profile of their locomotive radio was compromised by tunnel geometry and the debris field. Russian emergency coordinators knew there was a train in the tunnel. They did not know its cargo. The manifest would later clarify what was aboard. Military-designated mixed cargo, including artillery propellant canisters and fused 152 mm shells in transit from a production facility. A loaded ammunition train. Inside a collapsed tunnel. With emergency crews outside who could not safely enter because of structural instability and the unknown condition of the cargo. The first question the Russian tunnel rescue coordinator faced was whether the ammunition was stable, whether recovery operations, which required heavy equipment, vibration, percussive tools, could be conducted without triggering secondary detonation. This was not a theoretical concern. The cargo included artillery propellant, which is sensitive to heat, impact, and flame, all of which are produced by heavy tunnel rescue equipment. Russian authorities suspended active rescue operations pending structural stabilization assessment. In practical terms, this meant doing nothing heavy-handed inside the tunnel until engineers could certify that the collapse zone was not about to fail further and that the ammunition cargo could be safely worked around. That assessment took 4 days. 4 days during which the Severomuysk Tunnel remained closed. 4 days during which cargo backed up on the BAM in both directions. 4 days during which military logistics planners in Moscow attempted to route munitions shipments through the already overloaded Trans-Siberian corridor and discovered exactly what Ukrainian intelligence had predicted. There was no spare capacity. Every workaround created a new bottleneck. If you think about what modern warfare really demands, is it more important to destroy the frontline weapon or to break the supply chain that feeds it? That's a real question, not a rhetorical one. Drop your answer in the comments. East Alert readers consistently produce the most sophisticated tactical analysis of any channel covering this conflict, and I genuinely read what you write. The extraction of the GUR team is a separate operation that I'll describe in terms of what is known through open source reporting and confirmed indirectly through Russian law enforcement communications that became accessible to Ukrainian intelligence. The 8 operators dispersed immediately after the truck exited the tunnel. The 3 pairs who had traveled to Severomuysk by different routes departed by different routes. The logistics cover team drove west, maintaining their cover as contracted transport workers, reaching their next waypoint without contact. 2 other pairs traveled by rail, which was, in one of the operation's more ironic details, still functioning normally west of the collapse zone because the disruption was eastbound and westbound rail on the BAM uses separate tracks in most sections. The team leader and 1 signals specialist departed by a 3rd route that has not appeared in any confirmed reporting. Ukrainian officials have confirmed that all 8 operators returned from the operation. They have not confirmed the route. Russian Federal Security Service response to the incident was complicated by the initial uncertainty about whether the event was a catastrophic engineering failure or a deliberate act. The Severomuysk Ridge is geologically active. There had been documented incidents of minor seismic activity in the region, and tunnel integrity events in Soviet-era infrastructure were not unknown. The first official Russian statement attributed the tunnel closure to a technical incident pending investigation. That characterization held publicly for approximately 36 hours. What changed it was the discovery of the charge-mounting hardware. Emergency engineers working at the western end of the collapse zone found fragments of the stabilization mount that the demolition specialist had improvised. The fragments were metal, precision machined, in a configuration that did not match any authorized maintenance equipment in the BAM engineering inventory. An FSB forensic team was on site within 6 hours of the discovery. Their assessment was transmitted to Moscow within 12 hours. This was not a structural failure. This was Ukrainian military intelligence, executed inside Russian territory at a target that Russian security doctrine had classified as untouchable. The Russian internal response, partially reconstructed from intercepts analyzed by Ukrainian intelligence, involved significant friction between the FSB, which was responsible for infrastructure security, and the Russian Ministry of Transport, which had approved the tunnel's security posture as adequate. The argument? Simplified. FSB said the monitoring upgrades installed had been circumvented. Transport said they had approved what FSB recommended. FSB said Transport's implementation had been inadequate. Neither side wanted to own the failure. This institutional friction is not a footnote. It is strategically relevant. Because the consequence of the interagency argument was a delay in the comprehensive security review of other BAM infrastructure that should have followed immediately from the Severomuysk incident. That review was reportedly still incomplete when Ukrainian military operations continued on other fronts. Would Russia have caught the team if it had responded faster? Would a more coordinated FSB transport security protocol have detected the high-rail vehicle modification before the team entered the tunnel? Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of systems failure question that modern military doctrine is built on. If you believe tactics win wars, not just courage, not just technology, but the application of precise tactical thinking to strategic problems, type E-Stalert in the comments. Because this operation is a textbook demonstration of that principle. The structural assessment of Severomuysk Tunnel, as reconstructed from Russian engineering reports that became accessible through OSINT channels and indirect sourcing, identified the following damage profile. Primary collapse zone, 63 meters of tunnel length at the geological transition point. Total ceiling failure in this section. The track, tunnel lining, and overhead rock mass had collapsed into a rubble field that filled the bore cross-section from floor to remaining ceiling remnant. Estimated rubble volume in this section alone: approximately 4,000 cubic meters of mixed concrete, timber support elements, and fractured granite. Secondary collapse at expansion joint 2, partial ceiling failure over a 21-meter span. The track was intact but buried under approximately 8 meters of debris. Passable by personnel but not by rolling stock. Secondary collapse at expansion joint 3, 17 meters of ceiling degradation without full collapse. This section was assessed as unstable and requiring complete removal and reconstruction before any loads could pass. The freight train was inside the tunnel through all of this. The engine and first 11 cars were west of the primary collapse zone, between the collapse and the western exit. They were retrievable. Crews entered from the western portal and extracted them within 3 days of the assessment clearance. The remaining cars, 12 of them, including the cars carrying the ammunition cargo, were on the east side of the primary collapse. They were not retrievable until the rubble was cleared. Rubble clearance from the primary zone proceeded at an estimated rate of 300 to 400 cubic meters per day, using the heavy equipment that could be staged at the western portal. Total rubble volume to clear: 4,000 cubic meters. The math: 10 to 13 days to clear the primary zone alone before reconstruction could begin. Reconstruction of a tunnel bore section is not like repairing a road surface. It requires repositioning and securing the overhead rock mass or driving new support structures, installing new lining segments, and restoring track work to certified operational standards. For 63 meters of complete collapse in a 15-kilometer tunnel with active geological stress, Russian engineering estimates, drawn from the BAM's own historical maintenance records, suggested a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks for restoration to full operational capacity. That estimate assumed no complications, no secondary collapse events during clearance, no discovery of additional structural weakness in adjacent sections triggered by the initial blast-induced stress redistribution, no weather delays to the logistics of getting specialized tunnel restoration equipment to a remote Siberian site. 340 kilometers of westbound cargo was stalled. Ukrainian intelligence assessment put the military logistics impact at a reduction of approximately 22% in the total volume of artillery propellant and shell shipments reaching the Western distribution network from Eastern production facilities during the closure window. Not all military cargo traveled the BAM, but a meaningful fraction did, and that fraction was now delayed by weeks, not days. 22% reduction in propellant supply to frontline artillery units. That number travels. It reaches battery commanders. It reaches fire mission allocation. It reaches the decision of whether to fire 10 shells or 6 shells at a target. It reaches the rate of advance or the ability to hold ground under pressure. That is the strategic logic of the Severomuysk operation. 8 operators, 1 tunnel. A cascade effect that reached the trenches of Donetsk. What would NATO have done differently? Serious question. NATO doctrine has its own deep interdiction planning frameworks. SEED, strategic interdiction, infrastructure targeting in the context of Article 5 planning. How would a NATO Special Operations Planning cell have approached the same objective? Would they have attempted the same high-rail insertion methodology? Would they have used a larger team with more firepower and a faster exfil? Comment your tactical analysis. This is the kind of comparison that actually illuminates doctrine. Real tactics. Real consequences. East alert. The aftermath of the Severomuysk operation unfolded on multiple levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, the GUR team's return was handled without public acknowledgement from Ukrainian officials. Intelligence services do not confirm operations inside Russian territory. Doing so creates diplomatic complications and reveals operational capability in ways that reduce future effectiveness. The operators received their operational debrief. The demolition specialists' improvised stabilization mount solution was documented and incorporated into future training. The sensor defeat methodology using the high rail vehicle was noted as a technique for potential future use against similar monitored rail infrastructure. At the operational level, Ukrainian military logistics planners began tracking the BAM closure's cascading effects through publicly available rail traffic data, satellite imagery of staging yards, and intelligence reporting. The backup at the eastern Severomuysk terminal peaked at day 3, when the queue of eastbound and westbound trains extended beyond 5 kilometers in each direction. Russian rail authorities were diverting what they could to the Trans-Siberian corridor, but capacity limits were immediate and hard. The answer to the quiz question from earlier, how many consists and cargo vehicles were ultimately backed up on the BAM through the Severomuysk closure? The documented satellite imagery shows more than 50 trains in holding patterns in either direction at the peak of the disruption. Option C was correct. More than 50. At an average consist length of 45 cars, that represents more than 2,200 individual rail cars of cargo, civilian and military mixed, waiting for a 15-kilometer tunnel to reopen. In the broader context of Russian logistics, this created what analysts described as a compounding pressure event. The Trans-Siberian was already moving military cargo at rates that exceeded its rated capacity by approximately 15%, based on traffic analysis conducted by open-source researchers tracking locomotive movements. Adding the BAM overflow pushed that to an estimated 28% overcapacity. Rail infrastructure operates with significant tolerance buffers, but sustained overload accelerates wear on track, rolling stock, and switching equipment. Creating maintenance demands that are invisible in the short term but accumulate into reliability degradation over weeks and months. Subscribe to East Alert, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. This is analysis built on the same frameworks that professional military intelligence uses to assess strategic effect. We translate it for people who want to actually understand what's happening. What does this operation teach us? First, distance is not defense. Russia's assumption that the BAM was protected by remoteness was always complacency, not security. Modern special operations doctrine, and Ukrainian intelligence operations demonstrate this repeatedly, is designed precisely to exploit the gap between what a target's defenders believe is reachable and what a motivated, well-resourced operation can actually reach. Remoteness adds cost and complexity. It does not add invulnerability. Second, choke points multiply force. 8 operators cannot win a war, but 8 operators applied to the right point in an adversary's logistics network can generate effects that propagate far beyond the tactical footprint of the operation. The Severomuysk Tunnel was a single point of failure in a critical supply corridor. Identifying choke points and prioritizing them over tactically satisfying but strategically marginal targets is one of the core disciplines of modern warfare. Ukraine, limited in manpower and resources relative to Russia, has become exceptionally skilled at this targeting discipline. Third, sensor defeat through deception is more reliable than sensor defeat through jamming. The vibration sensor problem could theoretically have been approached through electronic countermeasures, jamming or spoofing the sensor signals. But the high-rail vehicle solution was more elegant and more reliable. It didn't defeat the sensors, it satisfied them. Deception that works within the adversary's system is harder to detect and counter than interference that attacks the system from outside. Fourth, the cascading effect of infrastructure interdiction is not immediately visible in battlefield reporting, but it is real and consequential. The Severomuysk operation did not appear in frontline contact reports. It appeared weeks later in the rate of Russian artillery fire, in the availability of propellant at forward ammunition supply points, in the tactical decisions made by Russian battery commanders who were told to conserve ammunition because supply was constrained. The quiz answer, confirmed. Option C. More than 50 consists backed up on the BAM through the primary closure period. The military logistics impact assessment places the operation among the most cost-effective deep interdiction actions of the current conflict in terms of strategic effect per operator hour expended. Was the decision to accept a 6-minute delay at the 4th placement point, rather than abandoning that charge position and using 3 charges instead of 4, the right tactical choice? The demolition specialist judged that 3 charges would produce a recoverable collapse rather than a catastrophic one. He used 6 extra minutes to ensure the 4th charge was properly placed. That judgment call extended the closure window from weeks to months. Was it worth the additional exposure time inside the tunnel? Think about it. Could Russian infrastructure security have prevented this? A comprehensive audit of BAM tunnel access protocols, combined with implementation of continuous movement monitoring rather than anomaly detection based on vibration signatures, would have significantly complicated the insertion methodology. But comprehensive implementation across thousands of kilometers of remote rail infrastructure is a resource demand that strains even a large bureaucracy. Russia's decision to upgrade sensors in the tunnel bore without upgrading access point monitoring at the high rail entry nodes created exactly the gap that the operation exploited. What would you have done differently? If you were the GUR planning cell, knowing what you now know about how the operation unfolded, the sensor upgrade discovery, the improvised mount solution, the 6-minute delay at charge point 4, what would you change in the planning framework? The Severomuysk Tunnel is quiet now. Repairs have proceeded. The bore has been partially restored. But the timeline of that restoration? Every week it remained closed. Every day the cargo queue extended. Every artillery shell that did not reach a Russian battery. Those are permanent facts in the record of this war. And the lesson that Russia's defense planners are now working to absorb is the same lesson that military history returns to in every era with every new technology. There is no untouchable target. There is only the target that no one has yet reached. Subscribe to East Alert, because preparation defeats improvisation. Understanding how operations like this are planned, executed, and assessed is the only way to understand where this war is actually going. Not in the headlines, but in the strategic calculus being run in GUR planning cells and Russian logistics headquarters simultaneously. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. East Alert.